Is that revival though? Or does it start in the heart? Does it come from a heart connecting with the Heavenly Father in an act of first love, expressed in community? Let's explore revival.
In 1904, there was a young bloke in a Bible college named Evan Roberts. He began to feel that God was sending an urgent message that he was going to pour out a mighty spirit of revival on Wales. Evan Roberts began attending various revival meetings. During one of these meetings, he was deeply moved by the Spirit, and as he prayed, he cried out to God, "Bend me, O Lord." That was a complete and total surrender of his will to God's will. Roberts soon returned to his home church to preach that message of revival. But his pastor was reluctant to allow him to speak, and in a compromise, the pastor announced that Roberts would be speaking following the regular prayer meeting. Any who wished to stay were welcome to do so. There were 17 people who stayed. Most of them were teenagers or quite young adults. Evan Roberts spoke in that church for nearly 2 hours with a simple 4-point message that he was convinced could help God bring revival. And I don't have the clicker. It's coming. But in the meantime, there's the second slide. This was his 4-point message. Confess all known sin to God. Deal with and get rid of any doubtful area of your life. Be ready to obey the Holy Spirit every time, immediately. Confess Christ publicly. So when Roberts was finished speaking, all 17 of these people were at the front on their knees crying out to God. They prayed until 2 a.m. that night, and it was the beginning of one of the greatest movements of God in our post-resurrection history. By the end of the week, over 60 people were won to Christ. And over the course of the next year and a half, revival swept through the nation of Wales. And over 1 million people were led to saving faith in Christ. The revival was so great that the natural culture in the whole of Wales changed dramatically. There were a number of bankruptcies that took place because the taverns and the liquor stores went out of business. Now, this is unbelievable, except for the fact that it's recorded in our history. Work at the coal mines was brought to a near standstill. If you know, Wales and coal mining goes together hand in hand. But have a listen to this. The mules who pulled the wagons were so used to hearing foul language from the workers that after the men who were saved spoke to the mules no longer recognised their voices and commands and just didn't function. The entire police force was dismissed for almost 18 months due to a complete lack of crime. One of the few court cases that was actually brought before a judge was highly unusual. The defendant came into the court and admitted his guilt. The judge led the man to Christ, and the jury closed the case by singing a hymn. The revival eventually made its way across the Atlantic to America and swept particularly through parts of New York and New Jersey. There was a section in the New York Times that recorded today's converts. It's true. Similar revival in Melbourne. John McNeil and another Presbyterian, James Balfour, longed for a renewal of the church by the Holy Spirit. They were elders at St Cuthbert's. And McNeill was a prominent parliamentarian and a businessman in the city. In his office in 1883, 27 Christians, mostly lay people, had formed the ESA, Evangelisation Society of Victoria. 19 years later, they invited Reuben Torrey, an American evangelist, to come to Melbourne. And in those days, would have probably taken him 6 weeks to get there. But he arrived into Melbourne with a song leader. Not a big team, just him and a song leader, in April 2nd, 1902, to do a 4-week mission. Now, I think this is unbelievable, but you can go into any library down in Victoria and find it. You probably find it in libraries here in Queensland. A smallish group of people were praying faithfully from 1883 forward. They'd previously also begun 30 home prayer meetings, which grew to a staggering total of 2,100 opportunities to gather in prayer meetings. They had 15,000 people attending these prayer meetings. Prayer was introduced intentionally into the framework of the Christian church, led by Presbyterians. By the time the missionaries arrived, and on the night before the first meeting, 40,000 people were waiting on God for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. They held meetings in the Melbourne Town Hall, and at the same time, Melbourne ministers held missions at 50 centres in the suburbs, including one in the Brighton Town Hall. The central meeting in Melbourne grew so large that it had to be moved to the exhibition building. Attendances totalled, wait for it, 250,000 people, 250,000 people each week, when Melbourne's total population was 1 million. It was bigger and a more important event than Federation the year before. Nearly 9,000 people became Christians. Whole families were brought to Christ. Lives were completely changed. The police, for some time after, in some areas, had very little work to do, and the church was renewed. What is revival? Times seem to have changed a little, and I want to admit that our world is nothing like it was in 1902 and 1904. Today we begin this new series that we hope will inspire and totally transform hearts and lives. Today, we want revival in our city, in our homes, in our nation, in our world. The clear thing in my mind when I think of revival is returning to my first love. Coming back to a right relationship with God. Being renewed, restored, revived, refreshed to a new and a very cleansing view of who God is and what He has done for me. It's restorative. And I'm going to try really hard not to say again, we need revival. I'm not sure how long I'm going to last. But I do want to focus on what it is. Billy Graham preached to 130,000 people at the MCG. It's still the record attendance at any venue in Australia, which means it's the record attendance for the MCG. Half of Australian population heard the gospel and a third responded. Praise God. The Australia we now live in is so different to the one my parents were born into. And I want to agree, our world is a darker place where revival actually seems almost impossible. But some of the things I've already said would seem impossible, right? And they're historical. They have happened. The resurrection itself seems impossible. And who would be game to say that it didn't happen in this place today? Not me. If you did bring tomatoes, I'd get them right there. You see, anything is possible with God. And I want to say this. Has God changed? Has anything changed? What part of God's power and Christ's resurrection power has diminished? What part of the work of the Holy Spirit has changed? The church, unfortunately, has changed. God has not changed. Culturally, church has changed. We are in desperate times because we desperately need a movement of God Almighty. And far too few seem really passionate about that. If God could bring revival in 1904, 1902 in our own country, or any other time for that matter, he can do it in Townsville in 23 and beyond. Amen? I want to carefully look at some of the conditions that God places on the outpouring of his Spirit in reviving his people. So if you have a Bible today, would you open them to 2 Chronicles 7? We're going to start reading from 14. 2 Chronicles 7:14, reading from the NIV. If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and will heal their land. I want to commence our series announcing first that this verse is often taken out of context or misrepresented. And I believe we need to be careful that we don't do this, either on Sundays or in our small groups. So to help us to stay faithful to the text, we've got to look at its context. And we'll do that progressively, but I want to announce directly that it's related to the temple and Israel being told to stay focused on God for their restoration. Now, something else that will rule our thinking over these next few weeks is this fact. God requires of us to obey him always. We see this throughout the Old Testament, particularly in Judges. God does not take obedience or its lack lightly. When we fail to obey, we have fallen into sin. There's no shortcut to obedience. We're either obedient or we are not. And also, God has given us many promises. We easily get excited about getting God's promises. We have the promise of the second coming. It energizes us. It's amazing thought to know that God will come and collect his church, that Jesus is coming again. It's a great promise, isn't it? And it's going to happen regardless of any of us. It's going to happen. The Bible says so. Jesus said so. It will happen. But we've sometimes missed the pathway to a lot of the promises. We miss the premise. We miss the conditional premise that comes before the promise. God doesn't have to prove himself to us. God doesn't have to show us anything. He is God, and that is that. So we need to remember that when he commands, our only response is obedience. True? Simple fact, right? God says some specific things that will apply to each of us. And as we unwrap the theology of revival that applies as we move through this series, obedience response of the heart, action, that our heart moves, and so our feet and our hands move with our heart, is our only worthy response. Look for the conditions of the promise in this verse. The first is underlined here. The first big thought for today is that God is looking out for people to revive. He wants to act. If my people. The if here is the beginning of the conditions that God is looking to be met before he's going to act. Clear that God is issuing a conditional promise to his people. Do these things, and I can't help myself but follow through on my promise. You'll hear it over and over in the next few weeks, but God is nowhere committed to bless us if we fail to obey him. He's carefully outlined the premise for every promise, and here in 2 Chronicles 7:14, we see him state the premise really, really clearly. If my people, God has an expectation of specific things before he brings revival. And these promises are only for those who place their faith in God. Don't know how I can emphasize that anymore. If my people, he doesn't say if the people, right? If my people. And it's true he's speaking to Israel. These promises are only for his people and no one else. We must understand that this is an exclusive deal that God offers to his people. Originally Israel, and post-resurrection, the promise is to us, his people, his followers, those who place faith in him, not those who expect something from him. Those who have faith in him, who believe in him, have committed to him, have transformed lives because of their desire for forgiveness, which leads to confession and repentance. We often forget that the work of revival always begins with God's own people first. Why? Because God must first renew his people before the real work of winning the world can take place. If he hasn't got his people faithful and obedient, he hasn't got much. In this Chronicles passage, God is speaking to Israel, who had broken away from their covenant with God. They were doing life on their terms, and God says, I want you back. I want to tell you something. Revival, therefore, by its very definition, refers to a renewing. It's about coming back. It's about restoration or being returned to a once better state of being. It's coming back to your first love. Reviving is something that needs some work to be restored. And I believe emphatically in the Bible, all the promises are in expectation that God's people will act like God's people. Is that fair to say? And God follows up their actions with the fulfillment of his promises. God wants us to act like we actually know that we belong to him. And the work of revival must begin with God's own people, but it's never meant to end there, because we are called by his name. God calls us out from the world. He calls us out from sin. And being a Christian means that we're meant to stand out from the rest of the world. We must live differently than the world because we value different things. We value an eternal promise, and we value a different lifestyle, and we value the holiness of our God. Amen? If we do not value these things, we need to question the spirit within us, because it might be a spirit of flesh. So we are called to be a holy priesthood, where every believer carries the responsibility for ministry, not just the pastor or the church leadership team. We're called to be Christ's witnesses in this world, to share his truth and boldly seek his power, and to be the people Jesus died to restore into a right relationship with the Father. He has claimed and he identifies his people, and we are known by a new name. Whenever a person comes to Christ, they are a new creation and are given the opportunity to live a transformed life. And by transformed, we speak in this pulpit regularly about transformation. And when we talk about transformed, we are talking about new creatures, new, renewed. When we came to Christ, we became associated with his name. We became Christian. We are in Christ. And that's an identity. Wow, that's an identity I cherish. Every single person who claims to know Jesus Christ either lifts his name or tears down his name. In the small group series, and there's plenty of them in the foyer today. Grab one. You'll be able to get it online as well, but there are paper copies out there as you leave today. And please don't forget, if you haven't already thought about it and made a decision in your mind, work out how you will go through this study series over these 8 weeks, because there'll be a guest speaker for May Mission Month in the middle of our 7-week series. You will see Habakkuk, chapter 3, 2-4 in the workbook this week. Habakkuk 3 opens up the idea of God restoring his people. In verse 2, we see the prophet announces he has heard from on high. He hears God. It affects him. He's afraid. He cries out for reviving, for restoration and revival. And in verse 3, what are the words? God came down in glory and praise. And here's the cheat sheet, right? Little tip sheet for this week. You'll see in the handbook, there's some dot lines. There's some dashes for you to fill in. God came is the answer. You'll see it when you look in the scriptures, but God came. You see, there was a premise and then there's a promise, and God honours his promises. When we call out, God comes. Isn't that beautiful? Restorative. And his brightness was as the light, a display of power. We have to look to God to be revived. And the key part of 2 Chronicles here is, in this context, we humble ourselves. So this helps us to see, as we jump back into 2 Chronicles, God is God, we're not. And so we can expect and hope that our response in his presence is one of awe, that we are inspired, that we have righteous fear. Because God desires for his people to humble themselves, to come to a place of recognition of who God truly is, and that is going to alter my behaviour. That is going to put some conditions on my vocal, what I speak. That's going to put some conditions on how I'm thinking. That's going to actually put some conditions on how I'm behaving in a shopping centre and at home, and when I have an opportunity to talk on the phone. When we humble ourselves, it is a conditioning process that's natural as a human being, that when we understand who God is and we have the right response to that, our behaviour alters for the good. Praise God. Now, he knows these things, which is why he's put it in the scripture. We know these things because we've lived some life, and we can prove that what the Bible actually demands of us is actually quite natural and incredibly positive, and the function works. If we follow Jesus, we just live better. We need to look to God to be revived. It's not coming anywhere else. You are in control, Lord God. You own the cattle on 1,000 hills. You are the boss. You know better than I do. You are right, and I am not. You deserve all glory. Humility transforms us. To be humble means to be brought low appropriately. Humility will catch up with you if you don't get it sorted. And the simple prayer that Evan Roberts prayed, bend me, O Lord. When we humble ourselves before God, we're allowing him to bend us to his will. And what happens when God bends us? So many things. Here's a few. It opens us to his guidance. It allows us to know his grace. It gives us a gentle heart, and it gives way to eternal glory. Once we allow God to bend us, we are not going to be the same. R.A. Torrey says this. Some years ago, we often sang a hymn, Take Time to Be Holy. Hands up straight if you know that song. Take time to be holy. All right? We may sing that sometime through this series. But here's my great wish. I know the song, but I wish we could understand what that really means today. It takes time to be holy. I think I need to go back, do I? Yeah. Because you can't be holy in a hurry. Sanctification is a process. And one of the key principles in revival is prayer. That's our challenge. Now, here's what I know, or what I think I know. Pretty much everyone here today prays. Most of us would pray with others in some context. The challenge for Northreach over the next 8 weeks is to pray regularly with someone else. How you pray is up to you. I'm not going to be prescriptive about that. I'm hoping that the Bible studies will give you some guide. I'm hoping that the messages will set some context. I'm hoping you've heard something today, but I'm not going to tell you how to pray, because the Spirit of God does that. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? Do you really believe that? Then allow the Spirit of God to teach you to pray. Because over 8 weeks, might just develop a new habit. Not necessarily of praying, but how you pray. Can't be bad if you make a concerted effort to allow the Spirit of God to teach you to pray, and you're using the Bible's open, and you're running through some texts that are going to illuminate some truth. It always does. You might have a new entry into the kingdom of God in how you pray. Can I invite you to stand? Because we're going to pray. Lord, we stand in your presence, and I believe that there are hearts here today who want to be revived. There are hearts, there are people who want to be restored to a first love relationship with Jesus Christ. They believe that you are Lord. There is no doubt in their minds. But Lord, it's really hard in our flesh and blood to always be in a place where we know we need to be, we should be, we want to be, because life is so busy and we've developed this culture of survival. And it's just gets in the way. Lord, would you revive us? Lord, would you send your Spirit with authority, in power, in gentleness, but in overtly getting our hearts. Lord, we want to surrender to you. We want to bend our will. We want to devote ourselves. We want to hear from you. Lord, would you hear our prayer? And Lord, would you give us time to devote to praying the way you want us to pray. This week starts today, every day. We want to make you Lord of our lives. Lord, hear our prayer.